Imagine standing at 25,000 feet. The air is so thin it feels like you are breathing through a straw. The wind isn't just blowing, it is screaming, tearing at your heavy wool coat. You are exhausted, you are freezing, and you are safe to go down. The path to life is right below your boots. But above you, lost in the mist, a man is trapped. He is alone. He is dying. Most men would descend. Most men would choose survival. But Pasang Kikuli was not most men. He looked up at the savage mountain, turned his back on safety, and climbed straight into the death zone. Welcome back to K2 Stories. I'm your host. If you have a deep respect for mountaineering history and the brave souls who paved the way, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe. It helps us keep these legends alive. Today, we aren't just talking about a mountain, we are talking about honor. We often hear about the famous Western climbers, the Mallorys, the Hillarys, the Mesner. But today, we are going to tell you the true, heart-wrenching story of a man whose name should be known in every household that admires courage. His name was Pasang Kikuli. He was a Sherpa, a tiger of the Himalayas. By the age of 28, he was already a legend. He held the German Red Cross Medal for heroism. He was one of the few men awarded the prestigious Tiger Badge by the Himalayan Club member number 8. He was the strongest, the bravest, and the most loyal. The year was 1939. The world was on the brink of World War II, but on the slopes of K2, a different kind of war was being waged, a war against the elements during the ill-fated American Karakoram Expedition. This is not just a story of a failed summit. It is the story of the ultimate sacrifice. Pasang Kikuli didn't just climb K2, he gave his soul to it. To understand why he made that fatal decision at Camp 4, we have to go back to the beginning. We have to understand what makes a man a tiger. To truly understand the tragedy of 1939, we must first look at the world as it was back then. The 1930s were the golden age of Himalayan mountaineering, but they were also the deadliest. There were no helicopters for rescue. There were no satellite phones to call home. There was no Gore-Tex or lightweight down suits. These men climbed in heavy wool, leather boots that froze as hard as iron, and hemp ropes that could snap when wet. In this era, the Sherpas were often seen merely as porters, the muscle behind the Western brains. But among the climbing elite, the real mountaineers knew the truth. Without the Sherpas, nobody reached the top. And among the Sherpas, there was an elite class, the strongest of the strong. Pasang Kikuli was one of them. Born in 1911, Kikuli wasn't a large man, but he was built of wire and grit. By the late 1930s, he had earned the title of Siddhartha Headman, the leader of the porters. This wasn't a job you got by applying. It was a rank you earned by surviving. His reputation was cemented 5 years earlier, on a different mountain, Nanga Parbat. In 1934, a German expedition attempted to summit Nanga Parbat, known as the Killer Mountain. It remains one of the most notorious disasters in mountaineering history. A massive, prolonged storm trapped the climbers high on the ridge. It was a slow-motion horror story. The German leader, Willy Merkel, and several others died of exhaustion and exposure. But amidst that freezing hell, Pasang Kikuli shone. While others were collapsing, Kikuli helped organize the retreat. He endured days without food, battling hurricane-force winds to help his comrades down. He watched friends die. He felt the cold take them. For his extraordinary bravery during that disaster, he was awarded the German Red Cross Medal. This was rare, a Sherpa, recognized by a European power for valor, but perhaps the honor that meant the most to him, and the one that tells us who he really was, came from the Himalayan Club. In 1939, they awarded him the Tiger Badge. Only the very best received this. It was the Medal of Honor for the high mountains. Kikuli was Tiger number 8. Think about that. In all the history of the Himalayas up to that point, he was the 8th man to be recognized as a true tiger. So, when 1939 rolled around, Pasang Kikuli wasn't just a hired hand, he was a veteran. He had looked death in the face on Nanga Parbat and walked away. He knew the cost of high altitude. He knew that when the mountain says no, you listen. Enter the 1939 American Karakoram Expedition. The team was led by Fritz Wiesner. Wiesner was a naturalized American citizen, born in Germany, and arguably one of the best climbers in the world at that time. He was technical, driven, and incredibly strong. He wanted K2. He wanted it bad, but the team he assembled was complicated. Unlike modern expeditions where teams train together for years, this group was a mix of personalities. There was Jack Durrance, a young, strong climber. There were others who fell ill early on. And then, there was Dudley Wolfe. You have to remember the name Dudley Wolfe. He wasn't a professional climber like Wiesner. He was a wealthy man, the son of a coffee merchant from Maine. He was older, heavy-set, and clumsy on the technical rocks. But he had heart, and he had money. He helped finance the trip. He wanted to prove himself. Wiesner hired Pasang Kikuli as his sirdar. It was a smart move. Wiesner knew that if things went wrong, and on K2, things always go wrong, he needed a man like Kikuli running the logistics. The expedition arrived at the base of K2 in June 1939. If you've never seen pictures of K2 from the Godwin-Austen Glacier, it's hard to describe the scale. Everest is massive, but it's a slope. K2 is a pyramid. It rises steeply on all sides, a perfect, jagged triangle shooting into the stratosphere. It looks unclimbable, it looks angry. As they set up base camp, the mood was optimistic, but there was a shadow hanging over them. Back home, Hitler was moving across Europe. The world was holding its breath for war. And here, in the silence of the Karakoram, the isolation was absolute. Kikuli, ever the professional, organized his team of Sherpas. He looked at the mountain with the eyes of a man who had seen the tragedy of 1934. He respected the cold. He checked the loads, he watched the weather. The climb began well. They established camps, moving higher and higher up the Abruzzi Ridge. Camp I, Camp 2, Camp 3. The house's chimney, a distinctive crack in the rock, was navigated. The team was making progress, but K2 is a game of attrition. Slowly, the team began to thin out. Members got sick, others lost their nerve. The altitude began to grind them down, physically and mentally. By mid-July, the expedition had stripped down to the bare bones. Most of the Americans had descended to base camp, exhausted or sick. High up on the mountain, only a few remained. Fritz Wiesner, the driven leader, Dudley Wolfe, the wealthy amateur who refused to quit, and the Sherpas, led by the tiger, Pasang Kikuli, they were pushing for the summit. They were so close, but the mountain was setting a trap made of ambition, miscommunication, and the thin, deadly air of the death zone. Pasang Kikuli had survived Nana Parbat by knowing when to retreat. But on K2, loyalty to his climbers would push him into a situation where retreat was no longer an option. As they moved to establish the high camps Camp 8 and Camp 9, the stage was set for one of the most controversial and heartbreaking mysteries in American climbing history. By mid-July, the mountain had distilled the team down to its absolute essence. There was no more politics. There were no more jokes. There was only the wind and the will to survive. At Camp 8, sitting at roughly 25,300 feet, the air contains only a third of the oxygen found at sea level. At this altitude, the human body is actively dying. Digestion stops, the blood thickens to sludge, the brain begins to misfire. Fritz Wiesner, the machine, was still strong. Pasang Kikuli, a young, incredibly talented Sherpa, not to be confused with our hero Pasang, who was managing the logistics below, was with him. And then there was Dudley Wolfe. Wolfe was in trouble. He wasn't sick in the traditional sense. He was fading. He had been high on the mountain for too long. He moved lethargically. He had lost his appetite, but he refused to go down. He had paid for this expedition, and he wanted to see it through. On July 19th, the decision was made. It was a decision that would be debated in climbing circles for the next century. Wiesner looked at Wolfe. He saw a man who couldn't climb technical rock at that altitude. But the weather was perfect to rare. Crystal clear window on K2. Wiesner couldn't waste it. He told Wolfe to stay put at Camp 8. "Wait here," he said. "We will go to the top and come back for you." Wolfe nodded. He would wait. He would serve as the support. Wiesner and Pasang Kikuli pushed up. They climbed higher than any human being had ever climbed on K2. They navigated the bottleneck. They traversed the terrifying slopes beneath the Serac. By late afternoon, they were agonizingly close, less than 800 feet from the summit. The prize was right there. They could see the curvature of the earth. But the sun was setting. In 1939, they didn't have lightweight LED headlamps. If they climbed into the dark, they would likely freeze to death. Pasang Kikuli, fearing the spirits of the night and the biting cold, refused to go further. Wiesner, despite his burning ambition, knew he couldn't climb alone. They turned around. Can you imagine the weight of that? Turning your back on K2's summit when it is right there? They descended back to Camp 8 in the dark. But tragedy had already begun to spin its web. On the descent, Wiesner lost his crampons, the metal spikes on his boots, essential for gripping the ice. It was a clumsy mistake, a sign of exhaustion. When they reunited with Wolfe at Camp 8, 2 days had passed. Wolfe had been alone in the death zone for 48 hours. He was out of matches. He hadn't melted snow for water. He was dehydrated, disoriented, and weaker than before. Wiesner knew the summit bid was over. The priority now was getting Dudley Wolfe down alive. They began the descent on July 22nd. It was a nightmare. Wolfe was stumbling. At one point, on the steep traverse, he slipped. He dragged the rope, nearly pulling Wiesner and Pasang Kikuli off the mountain face. They arrested the fall, but the message was clear. Wolfe could not make it down the technical sections in his current state. They reached Camp 7 around 24,700 feet. They were all exhausted. Wiesner made another critical decision. He decided that he and Pasang Kikuli would descend further to Camp 6 to get more food, supplies, and perhaps fresh support, then climb back up to help Wolfe down. "Wait here, Dudley," Wiesner said again. "We will be right back." Wolfe, sitting in his tent, surrounded by the howling wind, watched them leave. He was alone again. This is where the story turns from a struggle into a horror movie. Wiesner and Pasang Kikuli stumbled down to Camp Vi. They expected to find sleeping bags. They expected to find stoves. They expected to find food. They unzipped the tents, empty. Everything was gone. No sleeping bags. No fuel. Nothing. Confused and terrifyingly cold. They forced their tired bodies down to Camp V, empty. Camp 4, empty. It was as if humanity had vanished from the face of the earth. The mountain had been stripped. The sleeping bags, the reserve food, the air mattresses, the entire lifeline that connected them to the world below had been removed. Wiesner and Dawa Lama were now climbing for their lives. Without sleeping bags, a night in the open meant death. They were hallucinating from fatigue. They were starving. They stumbled down the Abruzzi ridge like ghosts, driven only by the primal instinct to not die. Finally, they reached base camp, collapsing into the arms of the bewildered team. What had happened? It was a catastrophic misunderstanding. A breakdown of communication that no one intended, but everyone would pay for. The Sherpas at the lower camps, led by a deputy, not Pasang Kikuli, but a man named Tendrup, had seen no movement on the high mountain for days. A spotter had claimed to see an avalanche sweep the upper slopes. They assumed Wiesner, Wolfe, and Dawa Lama were dead, following standard protocol to save the expedition's equipment. And believing there was no one left to save, they cleared the camps. They stripped the mountain clean to bring the gear home. When Wiesner stumbled into base camp half-dead with frostbitten toes and eyes burning with rage and confusion, the reality hit everyone like a physical blow. Dudley Wolfe wasn't dead. He was sitting at 24,700 feet, alone, with no food, no water, and he was waiting for friends who were now thousands of feet below, too weak to climb back up. The silence at base camp was heavier than the snow. They looked up at the peak, shrouded in mist. Somewhere up there, a man was slowly freezing to death, checking his watch, wondering where everyone was. This is the moment that separates the climbers from the legends. Fritz Wiesner was broken physically. He could not go back up. Pasang Dawa Lama was finished. His spirit and body were shattered. The other climbers were sick or incapable. Who was left? There was one man, the Sirdar. The man with the tiger medal. The man who had organized the porters, kept the peace, and watched the chaos unfold with a heavy heart. Pasang Kikuli stepped forward. He didn't have to. It wasn't his job to die for a wealthy American tourist. The British expeditions of the past had often treated Sherpas as expendable. But this was different. This was a suicide mission, to climb back up K2, past the stripped camps, carrying heavy loads, to rescue a man who was likely already dead. It was madness. But Pasang Kikuli looked at the mountain. He looked at the shattered Wiesner and he looked at his fellow Sherpas. He began to pack his bag. He wasn't going alone. He rallied a small team of the strongest Sherpas remaining, Pasang Kidder, Finsu and Kidder. They were going back into the death zone. They were going to save Dudley Wolfe. On July 28, 1939, Pasang Kikuli turned his back on safety for the last time. He was accompanied by 3 other Sherpas, Pasang Kidder, Finsu, and a man named Supring. They weren't carrying scientific instruments or cameras. They were carrying thermoses of hot tea, soup, and the desperate hope of saving a man who by all laws of nature should already be dead. The speed at which they climbed was inhuman. It had taken the main expedition weeks to establish the chain of camps up the Abruzzi ridge. Kikuli and his team did it in hours. They moved like snow leopards, quiet, efficient, and relentlessly fast. They bypassed the empty lower camps, ignoring the ghosts of the expedition, their eyes fixed on the upper slopes. By the evening of July 28, they reached the ruins of Camp Vi at 23,400 feet. They found the tents battered by the wind. They settled in for a freezing, anxious night. Above them, somewhere in the dark, was Dudley Wolfe. The next morning, July 29th, the weather held. This was it. Kikuli, Pasang Kidder, and Finsu prepared to make the final push to Camp 7. Suring, who was not as strong as the others, stayed behind at Camp 6 to keep the stove running and prepare hot liquids for their return. The 3 tigers climbed the steep snow slopes. The altitude was crushing, but their loyalty was stronger. Around noon, they reached Camp 7. They unzipped the tent. The smell hit them first, the stale, sick odor of a man who has been trapped in a nylon coffin for a week without hygiene or proper hydration. Dudley Wolfe was alive. But he wasn't the man they knew. He was sitting in the debris of his own survival. He was severely dehydrated. His eyes were glassy, staring past the Sherpas, seemingly unable to focus. This is a classic sign of the 1,000-yard stare brought on by extreme altitude and isolation. He was suffering from apathy, a dangerous condition where the will to survive simply evaporates. Kikuli offered him the hot tea. Wolfe drank it greedily. "You must come down, Sahib," Kikuli urged. "Now. We go now." But Wolfe shook his head. "I am ready to go," he murmured. "But tomorrow. I need to rest. Tomorrow." It was the lie the brain tells the body before it shuts down. Tomorrow. The Sherpas looked at each other. They were strong, but they were not giants. Camp 7 was perched on a steep, precarious slope. They could not carry a heavy man like Wolfe who weighed nearly 200 pounds in his gear down the technical rock steps if he couldn't help himself. If he slipped, he would take them all with him. They tried to cajole him. They pleaded. But Wolfe was immovable in his lethargy. Kikuli faced a terrible choice. They had no sleeping bags at Camp 7. If the 3 Sherpas stayed the night there to guard Wolfe, they would freeze to death. They had to go down to Camp Vi to sleep, recharge, and come back the next morning with ropes to physically drag Wolfe off the mountain, if necessary. "We will return," Kikuli promised, "tomorrow morning. You must be ready." The 3 Sherpas descended back to Camp Vi. They told Suring the bad news. "The Sahib is alive. But he is broken. We have to go back up. That night, the mountain began to breathe. The wind picked up. The canvas of the tents at Camp 6 snapped like gunshots. July 30th dawned with a storm. The wind was too ferocious to climb. They were trapped at Camp Vi for 24 hours, listening to the gale, knowing that every hour that passed was another nail in Dudley Wolfe's coffin. Can you imagine the torment in Kikuli's mind? He was safe at Camp Vi. He could have said, "The weather is too bad. We tried. We have to go down." No one would have blamed him. He had already done more than any Western climber had done. But he was Tiger number 8. He didn't leave men behind. On the morning of July 31st, the storm lulled. It wasn't perfect weather, but it was a window. Pasang Kikuli looked at Simmering. "Stay here," he said. "Keep the tea hot, Kikuli Pasang Kidder." And Finsu stepped out of the tent. They roped up. They looked up at the gray, swirling mist, hiding Camp 7. They began to climb. Simmering watched them go. He watched 3 small dots moving slowly against the vast, white wall of K2. He watched them navigate the deep snow. He watched them approach the ridge. And then, the clouds closed in. The white curtain fell. Simmering went back into the tent to wait. He melted snow. He waited for the sound of boots. He waited for the triumphant return of his friends with the American Sahib. He waited all day. He waited through the night. He waited through the next day. The silence on K2 is not peaceful. It is heavy. It presses on your eardrums. By August 2nd, Simmering knew he was the last man left high on the mountain. He was terrified. He packed his small bag and began the lonely, dangerous descent to base camp to deliver the news that would shatter the climbing world. The tigers were gone. When Simmering stumbled into base camp on August 3rd, he didn't have to say a word. The look in his eyes told the entire story. He was alone. Fritz Wiesner, the man whose ambition had driven the expedition, was crushed. He had spent days convincing himself that Kikuli, the invincible Kikuli, would perform a miracle. He believed that if anyone could drag Dudley Wolfe off that mountain, it was the tiger. But the mountain had taken them all. For a brief, desperate moment, Wiesner tried to rally. He wanted to go back up. He wanted to search. But the other climbers looked at him with a mixture of pity and horror. They were starving, frostbitten, and broken. To go back up now wasn't a rescue mission, it was mass suicide. They packed up base camp in a somber, heavy silence. They built a small cairn pile of stones as a memorial. They looked up at the summit, which now sparkled innocently in the sunlight, hiding the bodies of 4 men in its icy folds. They turned their backs on K2 and began the long trek out. But as they walked away, the questions began. Questions that would haunt the climbing community for decades. What happened up there? Did they reach Dudley Wolfe? Did they manage to get him out of the tent? Did they slip on the icy traverse while roped together, sending all 4 plummeting down the face? Or did an avalanche, silent and swift, sweep them off the ridge before they even reached the tent? For over 60 years, nobody knew. Pasang Kikuli, Pasang Kidder, Finsu, and Dudley Wolfe had simply vanished into the zone of silence. The aftermath of the 1939 expedition was ugly. When Wiesner returned to America, he wasn't greeted as a hero who had nearly summited. He was vilified. The American Alpine Club launched an investigation. The press was brutal. They blamed Wiesner for leaving Wolfe high on the mountain. They blamed him for the breakdown in communication. But amidst the finger-pointing and the lawsuits, a crucial narrative was lost. The world focused on the wealthy American, Dudley Wolfe, dying alone. They focused on the tragedy of the white climber. Few people stopped to talk about Pasang Kikuli. Think about the magnitude of what Kikuli did. In the history of warfare, when a soldier runs back into enemy fire to save a comrade, we give them the Medal of Honor. We write books about them. We name schools after them. Kikuli did exactly that. He wasn't a soldier following orders. He was a free man. He knew the risks better than anyone. He knew that Dudley Wolfe was heavy, immobile, and likely delirious. He knew that the camps were stripped. He knew the weather was turning. And yet, he climbed. Why? It wasn't for money. The pay for a Sherpa in 1939 was meager. It wasn't for glory. Sherpas rarely got their names in the newspapers. He climbed because of a code of brotherhood that transcends race, nationality, and class. On the mountain, you are all equal. You are all fighting the same enemy, gravity and cold, and you do not leave a man behind. Pasang Kikuli, the man with the German Red Cross medal, the man with the Himalayan Club Tiger badge number 8, died living up to the highest ideal of humanity. The tragedy of 1939 effectively shut down American attempts on K2 for over a decade. World War II erupted shortly after, and the world's attention shifted from the battles on the peaks to the battles in Europe and the Pacific. The story of the Tiger of K2 began to fade. He became a footnote, a name on a dusty list of casualties. But K2 does not forget. The mountain holds its secrets, but eventually, it gives them up. It would take generations, but the ice would eventually shift. The glacier would move, and the evidence of that final heroic struggle would eventually come to light, forcing the world to remember the sacrifice of Pasang Kikuli. For 63 years, the mountain kept its promise of silence. The mystery of 1939 hung over the climbing world like a dark cloud. Critics argued, historians debated, but the families of the lost men just waited. Then, in 2002, the glacier finally gave up a piece of the puzzle. A team exploring the Godwinnosten Glacier found human remains melting out of the ice at the foot of the mountain. It was Dudley Wolfe. The discovery confirmed what those who knew the character of the Sherpas had always believed. The team hadn't abandoned him. They hadn't died on the way up. They had reached him. They had died trying to save him. The fact that they were found together, or in proximity within the fall line, suggests that the end likely came quickly, perhaps a slip on the icy rocks, or an avalanche that swept the brave rescue party into the void. Pasang Kikuli did not have to die on K2. He had a life back in Nepal. He had a reputation that would have secured him work for decades, but he chose the hard path. He chose the path of honor. Today, when we look at the modern triumphs on Everest and K2, when we see the incredible feats of modern Sherpa record breakers like Kami, Rita, or Nimsdai Purja, we are looking at the spiritual descendants of Pasang Kikuli. He was the pioneer. He proved that the Sherpas were not just carrying the bags, they were carrying the soul of the expedition. He showed the world that courage has no nationality. In the end, Pasang Kikuli, Tiger number 8, teaches us a lesson that is more valuable than any summit view. He teaches us that true strength isn't about conquering a mountain. True strength is about what you are willing to sacrifice for others. He sleeps now in the eternal ice of the Karakoram, a guardian of the savage mountain. He is no longer just a porter. He is a part of the mountain itself. And as long as we tell his story, the tiger of K2 will never truly die. If you were moved by the courage of Pasang Kikuli and his team, please do not leave this video without hitting that like button. It tells YouTube that these stories of heroism matter. There are hundreds of untold stories buried in the snow of the Himalaya, stories of triumph, tragedy, and the indomitable human spirit. Here at K2 Stories, we are dedicated to digging them up and giving them the respect they deserve. But we can't do it without you. So, if you haven't already, please subscribe and ring that notification bell. Join our community, and I want to hear from you in the comments below. In your opinion, was the decision to strip the lower camps the greatest tragedy of 1939? Or was it the decision to leave Wolfe alone in the first place? Let's have a respectful discussion. This is K2 Stories, and I'll see you on the next climb. Stay safe.